ウンターほら楽しいね。笑わせます。ひょいカウンターやこれほら目も当てられないマイナスお別れだ。倒すどうだ見せてあげましょう。全カウンターその目逃がしません。ひょいほらせいたまに生きるなよ。ほら目も当てられないマイナスお別れだ。倒すビバビーノ終わってはいません。お互いターンユアマジックサーキですファイト捉えてくれよ。遅いマイナス熱い肉声もう一度ゼロトゥーザたまんねセクセク恐れなさい。さあカウンター目も当てられない遅い不覚でした。ゼロトゥーザ踊りなさい。はいゼロテイゼやり何時天文に至らずまだまだチリナ生きるなよ。そっしゃやり見えるかい見えるかいそっしゃさしきこれ下踊って目も当てられないそれでその隙もらったそうだよようやく会えたなバルダムよ。どうやらそちらはそちらで愉快なことになっているな。オープンユアマジックサーキットファイトやめとけカルンチほら遅いなんとって
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Tuesday Melt Battle Lounge with the 2 and KT. No actual sound problems today, just me being so happy that it's not hot that I forgot to actually double check whether or not the mic was on. Today's stream was technically brought to you by Frigidaire. But more realistically, it's finally cool enough in the US that we are more likely to have all of our streams for the week instead of just specific ones. If you are anywhere in the Eastern or Midwest US, you should be able to join us without too much issues with lag or rollback. I did set it to no rematches today. How weird. Fortunately, this game loads quite fast, so it's not really that bad. Honestly, I think in my experience it doesn't actually matter that much. You can spend almost as much time waiting for the rematch to kick in properly.
これはそこねそれ切れるなやったわねそれカウンター好きだよ飛んでけおまけよまだまだここねこれでフィニッシュ諦めなこのおまけ諦めなこの消えなさい
I had a better combo there.
やったわねカウンター甘く見てたわそこね好きだよまでは腐っていないな立ちなさいこんなんじゃ全然足りないわ
Today we're not specifically aiming at any given thing, but there's a lot to be done in terms of building up recognition potential for combos. Especially for players who don't have a lot of time to work on combos in the game in the first place. Most of the other skills you need for games like this carry over pretty well from games we already have. Misleading people, accuracy, figuring out where you want to be for whatever reason. Things like that. But as this is a very, as people will say, anime game, it means that if you don't have good enough defense under pressure, and even if you do have good enough defense under pressure but can't continuously and consistently out-damage your opponent, you'll be at a big disadvantage. Pushing forward in any way, making sure that you've got enough time to do any specific thing, and that you aren't stuck having too many interactions in which you basically just take a lot of health damage, but your opponent would take much less damage, is kind of a big deal. Learning things like how best to approach a matchup so that your opponent doesn't do damage if they have enough combos isn't as hard to pick up as confirming all of your own. This matchup, for example, is quite heavy on that. I can lessen the amount of damage Shiki does, because he does quite a lot, by being in the air for the right amount of time and in the right way. But if I do that, and in any way mess it up, this becomes what we call a 3-touch game pretty quickly. And it's that specific aspect of the game that you have to learn to deal with as a whole. This isn't really just an opponent doing any specific thing right or wrong, it's literally that they kill you in 3 hits if they know what the combos are. Whereas I can cause that change. But you'll notice that because I don't have better combos, the same situation doesn't lead to the same sort of thing for me. Making your opponent drop their combo more often is a good enough way to get you partially through matches. Understanding the matchup as a whole is an even better way. But as you face people with considerably more skill than you or considerably better combo skill than you, it really isn't enough to just keep your own damage down. You must at some point raise the amount you're doing. Still, it shouldn't necessarily be too discouraging, as understanding how to reduce your damage makes your opponent work harder, and if you are basically training and trying to improve and just fighting someone who is also trying the same thing, you can at least make something useful for them. Yes, they can grind their combos, but it is still completely meaningful for them to have to do that under harder conditions. So if you find yourself thinking, well, this is just pointless, I'm not challenging them at all, that's really not what's happening exactly. The more you make your opponent think about which 3 things they have done or can do in order to keep your situation, the better everything is. This requires a lot of faith in specific aspects though, because if you just try to defend, a game that moves at this speed doesn't usually offer you a lot of options there. And similarly, Wake Up, for certain characters, is extremely rewarding if you just defend. In this case, for example, if you just block Shiki for too long, he will eventually find the right timing or spacing to pretty much delete your health. And it's not necessarily that you are doing any specific thing too right or too wrong, but that you are thinking more so in terms of how to defend the character. Defending Shiki the character is fairly hard. That's the entire reason that the character is considered strong in the game. Similarly, when you meet an opponent for the first time, you don't know which exactly of their mix-ups or their focus they're going to be using when it comes to pressuring you. So if you can prevent being knocked down for a long time, yes, that's good, but the situation isn't going to be much better when you do get hit. But what you do need is some understanding of how to avoid getting hit in ways that generally benefit your opponent too much. One of the main ways that this is achieved is by making the opponent think about an option. You don't have a lot of time in a 3-touch game to make someone specifically think about an option. You push them on the very first interaction, let's say, to only do a specific thing. And then from there, now that you've shown them, well, I'll do this thing that seems kind of odd, they have to think about it. And the moment they have to think about it, you might be able to use a different option that you're more used to. The idea of simply hitting your opponent when you wake up the first time, most players will default to whatever beats your defense most often, whatever beats the mash most often. It's the easiest answer to that sort of situation, with basically no downside to them, especially if they haven't seen at any point any indication that you could beat them on damage. The quicker they can quote-unquote get rid of you by tearing through your options, the quicker everything will go. But it seems that that's all they had to do for today.
もう一度ゼロ KO が甘かったかなん 転生の終焉です。赤社の蛇。
さて、そうであれば良いのですが。
オープンユアマジックサーキット。ファイト。
遅い。
へいや、ゼロ。終わりですか。
ここ
教師だ。
マイナス熱い戦
もう一度。深く何時天文に至らず。
息苦しい。
Understanding layers of offense, and specifically which ones will cause you to take a lot of damage, is something that comes up in games but must often be relearned for entirely different games and setups. It's often good to try to learn these fairly early, the more complex methods and the more complex conversions, simply because if you try to push too far into the game without learning them at some point, you'll find that when you push on opponents who actually know how to defend the obvious, the like crouching to a string or etc., you may not be able to get anything on them on the knockdowns you do get. High rank players will generally have lots and lots of layers for their offense. But, in general, knocking people down is clearly not enough, and understanding what to do with that matters a lot more. This game doesn't specifically speaking favor defenders, but because there are so many good options for defense if you really want to use them, you certainly don't have nothing. It's not a matter of, I'm defending, therefore I'm going to die. It's specifically knowing what way is the first or second way you should try to convince your opponent that you actually are going to defend fully. If you like playing trickier offense on Wake Up, this probably isn't the style of game for you, as it just isn't the way this type of game tends to work. You have to be extremely good at neutral, and usually playing a neutral heavy character in order for this to pay off. There are of course such characters in this game, but benefiting from that specific skill type is something that they also have. There's always a situation where just understanding that you can do this completely crazy trick to make your opponent not block on their wake up, or even get some throw setup that leads into big damage, happens in nearly every character situation. It's just a question of how often it happens and how often you need to be able to mislead your opponent. I always end up feeling sorry for people like Kabaji, I believe it was, because the better they get at the game, the less likely it is that other people are going to want to keep playing the game. Which is kind of sad because it results in them having, like, no training partners or no people to fight. Normally I figure that the E rank on my marker will keep certain types of people from joining, but on the other hand, it could simply be that there isn't actually anyone else to fight, because if you've gotten too good, the game kind of stagnates in this way.
ハムスはニューチャレンジ。
There's a similar calculation that has to be done per character for exactly how much damage, based on once again the same style of combo system and other interactions, how much damage you do get if you actually do the knockdown. Some characters get lots of damage off of baiting the opponent into trying to wake up with something and then shielding. But if you don't know all of the combos, that's not a good reason necessarily to not do the thing. It's also good to get experience with people who will in fact go through everything they can in their arsenal of offense to beat you. Well, I hope they're still finding opponents out there somewhere. I'm always surprised when they join in the first place, but you know. Part of the reason this happens is simply that this specific situation is so very hyper, let's say. Getting in super close always triggers, for the majority of people, a feeling that they must immediately do something. And that is among the few things you actually should try to get over. Not necessarily because heavy offense characters will not immediately do something, but if you panic too much, you won't be thinking about what it is they'll actually do. Because the game has so many layers as well, understanding what exactly does count as valid offense versus not can be super difficult. This is true of all games, but normally it's not moving at quite the same speed. For example, in Arcwade's case, you have to worry much more about her actually using a throw because she will do more things. Some characters are very limited in what they will do to you based on throws, but she's not that limited. It's also important to not speed yourself up too much, just because you've been cornered like this. Training to just not care is important for all sorts of other reasons. And this applies whether or not you are defensive or offensive as a player. Games like this give you invincible moves for a reason. Those who are particularly confident in their offensive options have an advantage over defenders because they are not thinking about what you're planning on doing at all. If it's in their mind that an interaction is about to happen that is basically straight up win or lose from their end, and in this game where it's even more complex than that, it's not just am I going to win or lose this, especially if you're low on meter, but I'm definitely going to get something and then I have to move on from there. They're mentally preparing for their own offense structure, whereas you as the defender are sometimes not even aware of what that structure is yet. Experience will carry you forward on this. You don't really have to guess which one is the best option as much as some people might think. But it does help to understand that if you don't know what to choose, there is something in matchup information that can help you. When I say that, I specifically mean knowing what your opponent's character gets the most damage off of will at least keep the match going longer. So if you were playing well in neutral enough to think through an option for the match as a whole, you're better off specifically seeing what happens. Even though there are quite a few characters, not Shiki, who actually lose out a lot and don't benefit from things like starting a combo with their 2A, you do have to think about it anyway. For example, that moment was almost exactly that. I had no meter. This character benefits the most from hitting a button on wake up. I didn't shield because I thought maybe I would not need to this time. But that was not a good point to be doing that. It should have been almost automatic to decide, the benefit here for my opponent is to hit me, and their situation is already relatively desperate, so I have a good reason to expect them to hit me. In this case, I have a lot of meter. Imperfectly timed versions of dash up 2A stuff can often be neutral jumped, and it's something you have to learn in a lot of games, but in particular for these games where you have a lot of aerial mobility to begin with and could go around the situation rather than just, okay, I've jumped straight up now I have to wait until I come all the way back down in the same spot I've started, and my opponent can do a bunch of things to me from here because they were the one who were attacking. They had advantage. They just had to expect or not expect the jump, and that's it. In this game, you have a lot of options, depending on your character, as to how exactly that jump works. And for some characters, if you're expecting for whatever reason that your opponent will miss a little bit, and you have a rising move, particularly in your moon move options, you can often cancel that move itself into a jump and get extra options for escapes and situations. You can even jump shield, a common, well, I guess it's jump guard in Under Night. But it is a fairly useful option for people who try to do air stuff that messes you up, as long as they don't have too many different routes from there, or if they've not shown you any and you want to get ahead of it as soon as possible.
マジックサーキットファイト逃がしません。
As you continue in this way, you will find yourself facing more and more of the stray hits situation, at which point you really shouldn't be concerned with whether or not a higher ranked or more experienced player is actually winning per se, because they're going to have lots more experience and practice with doing the difficult to convert confusing combos. And it's your job, as someone who I would assume enjoys the game enough to keep playing it, to figure out which of those you need for yourself based on the matchup that they give you. These can be kind of hard to practice though, even with bots provided, and we've only provided I think one. You're not necessarily going to have a lot of options for learning that aspect of matchups, because you would need to be able to set up the same situation as the stray hit. Even this character technically can prevent you from having many options on Wake Up, because a zoner character normally gets more advantage the further they are away, but that also applies on their Wake Up, because if you shield on Wake Up, it is more likely that they're going to have a counter for your shield ready and waiting. They're usually at more of a disadvantage themselves when it comes to this, simply because this type of character is generally not allowed to have really good options from those positions. Specifically when they are the one on defense from the knockdown, you won't necessarily find that to be a main thing that they do. They don't necessarily have good invincible moves to wake up with, and the situation tends to shift a little bit too quickly. It technically means that it's a good time to learn to quickly make decisions about your offense routes, simply because your opponent doesn't really have any options to stop a lot of them compared to many characters. But what you will end up facing a lot of the time is the fact that you can't even get in to do it to begin with. Understanding how to remain calm enough to prevent yourself from taking damage against zoning and simply not worrying is your main option. Once you've gotten that down, then you can work on things like, well, this character doesn't have as many good wake-ups, or this character's jumping attacks don't come down on my head in the same way, and so on down.
「殺しには空いているんだがね」笑い話で済めばいいがな。
オープンユアマジックサーキットファイト。
たまんちょいと言ってな。せっおそそれ熱いやるな。そこだろ。もろい。ちょいと言ってな。行くせくシュー玉暴力さんぞ。ここからすまれ。どう吐き出せ。天下に死にあらかった
ターンユアマジックサーキットファイト。
今度お別れだ。行くぞよ。飛ばすんだ。もろいね。
カウンター
やるね。バラす。天下見えている。そこだろ。軽いね。たまんねえ。ちょいと言ってな。動け。今後
The post-throw knockdown setup is one of the most meaningful ones as a generality in this game, because it does tell you a lot about how they expect you to play the character. Koma's knockdowns generally leave him close enough that he can use his multiple, basically unstoppable offense options. There are enough command grabs in here that you can be shut down even if you go for shield, so you can't just decide, well, I should stop this character from hitting me. And while neutral jumping is probably a better option than most things, this only depends on the player managing to mess up their same knockdown option. If you're knocked down by Koma, there's a decent chance that you are not going to just get out of it, forcing you to rely on invincible moves much more, unfortunately, against a character who can actually hit pretty hard. Your best bet is probably the fact that Koma's options for actually grabbing you are a little more telegraphed, and you'll find yourself spending a lot more time trying to figure out whether or not it's a good idea. Unfortunately, this doesn't prevent you from just being regular thrown. On top of all of that, he has basically a point where he can armor himself so much that you can't do anything anyway. Timing slightly off. This character gets a lot of control over whether or not she's doing any given thing, and this allows for a style of things that you don't see that often. It is something I'm familiar with though, because it is, strictly speaking, an ability type that Archmage shares. Being able to simply do your combo at a different timing, or try to fake your opponent into thinking you're going to do your wake up option when you're not, ends up being really helpful. You can just hit 2A once to make your opponent block, and if that's somehow rewarding to you in any way, now you've got a new combo route or offense route. You're free to spell that word however you like. It's particularly useful for characters like those too, because rather than spending their time trying to make sure their attacks actually hit, or that their attacks are faster than the opponent, they benefit from being able to set up situations where they have even more frame advantage, but in the form that they're much more likely to be able to convert properly off of. Good example there. Knowing that you absolutely have the way of getting to, I'm going to be plus now, and I'm going to be the type of plus that I know is a mix-up, allows you to control a lot of the aspects of this matchup type.
カブスはニューチャレンジャー。いいわ。相手になってはマジックサーキット。ファイト。いや、カウンター諦めなさい。逃がさない。いや、それで甘い。ビンゴよ。
軽い
Press that too late.
まだまだ離れて。いや、
It's for this reason that I end up facing Koma in the same way.
それビンゴ。残念。いや、
A lot of the interactions that these two have are related primarily to whether or not it's a good idea for Koma to keep attacking, more so than whether or not it's specifically difficult.
やったこの猫返し。いけ。止め。全開。これはせーの。
Similarly, that was almost intentionally fully misleading. Just, I'm not doing this move because I plan to hit you with it even a little bit, only to make you think about whether or not it was a good idea, and then do something else.
やったわ。カウンター。まだ諦めなさい。逃がさない。うるさい。猫返し。行くわ。離れて。それ。諦めなさい。逃がさない。いや。カウンター。おりゃー。カウンター。やった離れて。や見える。いけ。これならどう。なんだ、全然弱いんだ。あなた、この国の古い根血？人と混ざってはいるけど、血の質は厳重クラスよ。
In this case, therefore, the main focus should technically be, how do I get the knockdown to begin with? But because Archway does not have basically any armor that reaches Vlov, and no really long-range strike to use under most circumstances, because a lot of the stuff you think hits is not actually invincible enough. You just have to know. You have to know your position really, really well. And in my case, I tend to burn a lot of meter doing this. Ooh, that bat dash. Well done. That one I was not expecting to hit, though. Oh right, I didn't press shield. And I forgot I was overhead. The reason I wouldn't just shield is because timing the actual follow-up for your shield is actually dependent on where Vlov is. As I mentioned before, if you want to actually get advantage, you care about how long it's been since your opponent started the move, but an actual move that crosses the screen, a move that puts you in a position of I'm blocking because my opponent kept me off for very long. That can be manipulated by your opponent. They're the ones setting up whether or not you can in fact hit them after blocking or in this case shielding it. And similarly, since some of his moves have a lot of knockback, you have to shield sometimes anyway. But if you think you've got time to get into position, that's what really matters. You can pay attention to the fact that you need to shield Lav's moves not necessarily so much because you intend to actually stop this, but simply because if you shield them, you don't get pushed backward. And this is super important for your skill at getting toward the opponent. If you get pushed back every time, then, well, you can think of it from a design perspective. Why would they have bothered to make it so that the two things do different things if it was not going to somehow benefit one or the other player, or just help with balance? If you shield correctly when you're at the right position, everything's great. If you were at the wrong position, for whatever reason, it doesn't really matter if you shield it or not, obviously. In fact, in some cases, you might specifically not want to shield because of this. That situation is pretty rare, but it does exist. The high chase, available to basically 3 characters, I think. I think the problem Ami made here was sitting quietly when the opponent had immediately switched to offensive positioning, mentally. But you can't necessarily know what they have or haven't done, so it's not like it helps. This is still helpful because it causes a lot of usage of meter on Lav's side to be in that position. That hit way less than I expected, but even though he's a big body character, you still have to deal with it. Perfectly done. Literally perfectly done. For characters like Red Arcade and Lav, there's always the decision you have to make of, if I shield this, should I actually hit another button? Because whether or not your shield has put you into a good position or not isn't necessarily something that's obvious. And he does a lot of damage, as you've just seen demonstrated. He has one of the strongest conversions off that situation in the game due to his long reach and basically automatic combo from it. So that is an underlying aspect of this matchup. Your opponent is explicitly trying to get you set up to go in on an incorrect shield or some similar interaction. You don't necessarily get anything out of pushing harder if they were the one that controlled where you work up until that moment. If you find yourself getting frustrated, just remember that you should be frustrated in your own way. Don't just decide, well, I'm just going to shield you because you keep on doing this. Because both the shielding, the not shielding, every single thing that's happening here is being set up so that the benefit is toward Lav's side, assuming that the player understood enough that they have to move to a specific position. Once they've moved to that position, the only thing you can do is basically play a Touhou game, get through because you know exactly where to go, or because you're daring enough to try something that they haven't thought of yet. There is one thing that tends to matter here though, and it's not very obvious because it's not something that comes up in many other games at all. If you have shield as an option, you also have a difference in timing between when you actually shield and when you press the button to use the thing that shield gives you. you can shield, wait a moment longer than you might expect, and then do the B teleport or even do the BC to try to strike at them. I think that's probably better. For the other zoners in this game, that tends to be a lot more important than for Vlav because Vlav is a pure zoner. He is given the advantage even in situations where you might otherwise have difficulty on, say, Red Arcwade or someone like that. For those characters, knowing exactly when to hit the button after shielding affects other aspects of it. But for Vlav in general, your difficulty is, were you standing in the right place somehow? Or did you jump to the right height and shield from there? Because the good thing about the teleporty style shield is that you'll get to the other side anyway. It doesn't really change that much. This is actually an interaction that comes up a lot between these two characters as well. By being in exactly the right position and then using armored moves correctly, Koma can set up more offense on Roa than you might otherwise expect. Generally, his charge 2C is the best way to do this, mainly because if you were close enough that you thought that move was going to hit in the first place, anything Roa does to try to escape it will normally be chaseable by one of Koma's other options. And because you can't do certain moves out of backdash quickly enough, there's an option for improving your overall damage this way. Of course, your opponent could just shield the charge 2C, which is kind of what you're hoping they start doing. Your capacity to deal more damage in different ways is drastically reduced from the Roa side if you are constantly thinking about shielding charge 2C. But this only applies to those specific situations in neutral where it actually matters a lot. Koma has lots of other powerful options for getting closer, so you mostly only care about this when you can't do so for some reason. In fact, it's generally a mental shift quite quickly between does my opponent have meter and does my opponent not have meter. When Roa has no meter, particularly at ends of situations like this, you can make them want to deal with the 2C and get all of your benefits off that. But as soon as they have meter, you should consider that you're at least likely to take some situation worth of damage. And you just decide whether or not that means anything to you. And there's what I would mention before. The two spaces that they interact in just leaves Koma with just enough I'm actually grabbing you now, and any effort from Roa to avoid this, as far as I've ever seen, you don't get punished for it. There's nothing to punish you with. You can explicitly see here, for example, where any given increase in combo ability will generally increase your effectiveness overall, but even if you can't come up with a strong combo that you can actually do massively long execution for, it's often important to figure out one that ends in a position you like. This improves your ability to focus in many situations simply because your opponent can't necessarily move out of your, let's call it pressure, whatever it happens to be, as easily. If your knockdown puts your opponent where you expect them to be and where they are least effective against your character, until you have gotten to the point of knowing a much better combo for damage, that probably should be your go-to combo, as it is the best way to get more and more practice out of your own offense. In many cases, this is even worth using at least Moon Meter for, because you're already in a situation where if you got the knockdown quote-unquote correctly, you're going to get the Moon Meter back, or you kind of just did. Similarly, thinking in this way will be better at teaching you whether or not a given knockdown that you can use to get through situations, particularly bad situations, is actually worth using when you don't know what else to do. This matchup is one where it comes up a lot, because both of these characters have fairly good control over which route their combo ends with. They also both have specific fighting styles that counter the other at certain spacings, so you'll end up with more positions where one of them is definitely advantaged. CL's throw, for example, isn't necessarily a, let's call it, big reward situation. She can, of course, always pressure using her various key throws, but even this isn't necessarily enough. But off we go into the last on-stream match of the night. The lounge will probably stay open for a while longer. After all, this is the time we practice said combos. Though in the upcoming weeks, now that DNF has settled down, we're more likely to be able to hit the training mode in this game more often. And that probably means we're going back to bot development. Since DNF does not allow for any in the first place, might as well develop them here. This is my situation, as you've probably seen. There's probably a much better combo, or whole set of combos that I could do rather than the knockdown I tend to go for. But I'm playing too offensively, because again, this comes up all the time, particularly in this matchup. My opponent's offense doesn't stand up to mine as easily. But their defense is a matter of, am I doing it right? See? And because she does so much damage in specific ways, my better option is almost always to whiff punish and be misleading while playing pretty quietly. This is particularly important because getting enough on CL for me to get actual meter tends to be a struggle. But an opponent who is in any way waiting for you to make certain decisions is a lot more limited in terms of what they can actually do. I'm surprised sometimes at the amount of damage they let this character do. But the whole point is that you're not supposed to get hit by the black keys, so... You can find all of our bots at our website 2-mk.org, and information on when we're streaming and what we are streaming on our Twitter 2_mk_FGC. Tomorrow we should be able to have some Wednesday night in Birth for you, as it will be cooler. And you can expect that Feeling Thursday will still happen, our KOF Battle Lounge. But this has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.